All right, ladies and gentlemen, our panel discussion is on visionary policy decisions are must for urban reform to take root in a city's framework. Our panel will be discussing the relevance and role of policy in smart cities. We have Mr. Derek Khanna with us, Mr. Bipin Kumar, Mr. Manu Fernandez, and Mr. R.K.Jha. So, ladies and gentlemen, can we have a huge round of applause, please, for all the dignitaries present amongst us? Thank you so much for participating in the panel discussion, gentlemen. And this session is moderated by Ms. Rupali Gupte. Ladies and gentlemen, she's an architect and urbanist. Her works include research on emerging urban conditions, housing, mobility, and post-industrial landscapes. Not only this, she has a wide range of publications and has worked, taught, and delivered lectures across the world. And now, I request Ms. Rupali Gupte to please start the panel discussion. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just looking for the intros. So this panel is called State Smart, and we are trying to understand what the role of the state is in as far as smart cities are concerned. So we have a very diverse panel over here. I'm going to just read out a bit of their bios. So there's Bipin Kumar. That's Bipin Kumar there. He's the chair of the Smart City Group for the TEC-DOT Ministry of Communication and IT, and is a core member of the National Working Group in International Telecommunication Union, SG on Smart Sustainable Communities. He's also an invited expert at the TSDSI, where until recently he has led the group on smart cities. Derek Khanna is a political commentator, columnist, and associate at Fenwick and West. He was listed at Forbes 2014 in the 30 under 30 kind of list in law and policy, and also writes regularly for Forbes, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Atlantic, and National Review online. Manu Fernandez is the founder of Human Scale Cities, a project of urban analysis dealing with the current debates on cities, urban policies, and local action. As a researcher and urban policy consultant for the last 10 years, Manu has been involved in projects related to local sustainability and analysis of urban communities. And last is Mr. R.K.Jha. You've already heard him speak here. Mr. Jha is the CEO of Smart City Initiatives at IL&FS in Mumbai. R.K.Jha has over 49 years of professional experience in planning, design, project development, execution, and research and development of large projects covering town planning, transportation planning, detail planning, and design of integrated urban infrastructures. So what I'll do is I've kind of framed 3 questions for all of them, and what will be interesting is that because they come from very, very diverse backgrounds, it'll be nice for us to compare their own experiences across. And then if we have time, after the 3 questions that I have formulated, we'll open the house to the audience. So the first question for all of you is, I think all of you at some point have been involved with the state, right, at various levels, whether it's consultancy or working, directly with the government. So for me, it's interesting to understand how you look at the role of the state as far as smart cities are concerned, particularly in the making of smart communities, right? So what is the role, and also what is the imagination that the state should have? Can we start with Manu?
Yep. Can you hear me? Yep. Okay, well, first of all, just to understand maybe my approach or my kind of understanding, I work in the in-betweens of many different things. I work from a social sciences perspective, from economics, from sociology, even anthropology. So I'm not a technologist, I'm not an engineer, but I've been from the very first minute in the last 5 years concerned about what we were talking about when we started talking about the smart cities. Because I first had the impression of the feeling or the suspicion that we were missing many things, at least in the first years that we started to think about this idea of smart cities. And that's why when I think about the role of institutions, about the role of what kind of role public institutions can play in this scenario of the smart cities, I tend to think that the first idea of how they can foster these kind of projects is that first they have to keep in mind that they have to work for the benefit of inhabitants, their own citizens, and this may seem quite obvious in different parts of the world, but in the end it's the basic role of institutions in our societies, and maybe sometimes the way the smart city idea has been framed, has been even marketed, has tended to focus too much on the benefits that private actors can take from those projects, and that's fine, it's always good, but public institutions have to be sure that they can be defending the expectations, the needs, the problems, and the issues from their inhabitants. If we still think that our cities have to be, and I think, of course, our cities have to develop in a more democratic way.
I'm going to start with two stories and then explain why it's of relevance for this conference. Many people don't know about the history and the emergence of the modern automobile, but Great Britain perfected, the UK, perfected the technology behind the combustion engine and the modern automobile as we know it. But in Great Britain, while you had all these visionaries and entrepreneurs and scientists developing the technology, the politicians didn't keep up. And the law in place in the 19th century when they developed the modern car was called the Red Flag Act. The Red Flag Act of the 19th century required that 3 people be in a vehicle at all times in order for the car to drive. You had to have a driver. That part makes sense to me. You had to have somebody in the back seat to fill up with gasoline, because of course the driver couldn't also be the same person to fill up the vehicle. And you had to have a third person to walk in front of the car with a red flag to warn oncoming people, including the horses and pedestrians, that there is a car approaching. And to add insult to injury, the law required a national speed limit of around 3 kilometers per hour. Now, needless to say, no one would go about building or selling, or no one wanted to buy a car in Great Britain. It's no coincidence that the very country that designed the technology would then export the technology to another country to build. Many of those companies, Ford Automotive, for example, in the United States, were built during the time these laws were in place. When a young Henry Ford was building cars in the 1890s, 3 kilometers per hour was the speed limit. That's the first story. It's not a coincidence that innovation takes place in areas that are more friendly and foster what I call, or I will teach you, is called permissionless innovation. The idea of not having to ask permission from a regulator, or particularly from an incumbent business, in order to launch your company and compete. The second story may seem a little bit more abstract. I want you to imagine that in 2004, a young Mark Zuckerberg, when coming up with the idea behind Facebook, before he launches the website, he has to get permission from a government regulator to become a licensed social network. And then he has to take an exam to be a licensed social network, and he has to be accredited, in my case, in the United States, in every state in the Union, 50 states, or 89 states around the world. I think everyone here recognizes that there will be no such thing as Facebook. The whole idea is crazy. And that's the reason why we see such incredible growth in online startups and in the app economy, because no one has to ask permission to launch these companies. At the same time, as all of you know, this is not what the physical world has historically looked like. And that's one reason why our cities look very similar to the cities of the early 20th century. But there are new technologies on the horizon that are going to completely change what it means to live and operate in a city. And that's what I wanted to impress upon you today, which is if we're designing the cities of tomorrow, if we're designing a 10-year trajectory, we can't just say, where do we want to be in 10 years? We have to recognize the ground underneath us is fundamentally shifting. The underlying technologies are going to create a very different world in 2025. There are two major developments I wanted to bring to your attention. It used to be that startups were online companies like Facebook or Google or Twitter, but increasingly startups are affecting the physical world. You have SpaceX, you have Tesla, you have even Google, and other companies, Uber, that are transforming the physical world. And this means that we have to be nimble and recognize what's happening so that way the state gets out of the way. Because very rarely can the state actually help. Primarily the state can hinder these new technological developments. And the two ones I wanted to focus upon are the emergence of autonomous robotic car driving and Uber, Ola, other type of ride-sharing technologies. Now the first one I'm going to focus on is Uber and Ola. Other markets have different names for these, but it's basically the idea of using your phone to request a car on demand to pick you up, usually extremely cheaply, particularly in the Indian market. I've heard from several people in India already in my week here. I have family in Gurgaon, so I come out here quite often, that many people are considering not even having a car anymore and just taking Uber. And in the United States, this is very much the case. Many young people no longer desire to buy a car. They prefer to have a ride-sharing-like option, whether it be Uber, there's another domestic competitor called Lyft, because it's actually cheaper and significantly easier. So with the emergence of these technologies, and this is early days for each of them, we need to be aware that the idea of every person having their own car may actually not be true in 2025. These technologies may, for some people, not necessarily everyone, but may be an economic competitor that's actually better than car ownership. The second thing we need to keep in mind is autonomous cars. Or robotic cars, basically the idea of not having to have a human drive the vehicle anymore. So Google has robotic cars that have driven up to about 2 million miles on the road, causing 0 accidents so far. That's incredible. And you have a major race going on between Google and Mercedes-Benz and Tesla and Uber and probably Apple to develop the first fully functional autonomous car. This fall, you have Tesla's Model S having autonomous car features. The autonomous car revolution is upon us now. And if you're not designing a city recognizing that these technologies are going to come online in the next 5-10 years, then you should be out of a job, because your job is to look at the future developments, and this is what's going to happen. And the change here isn't merely the upper class being able to sit in the back of their car and be chauffeured. It's going to be a completely different definition of what a vehicle is or what the city is. I don't want to monopolize the whole panel, but one case in point is the average person wants to live about 20 minutes from their job. Well, autonomous cars get rid of all traffic. If they get rid of all traffic, then the definition of living 20 minutes from your job, you could live in Gurgaon and commute to Delhi. You could live in Goa and commute to Delhi if the speed limit's fast enough. That changes where people live. It changes what it means to live. It changes the family structure. It changes so many things. And if we're not planning our cities for these technological developments on the horizon, then we're really planning cities for what we wanted the 1990s to look like, as opposed to what 2025 is going to look like.
Bipin?
Derek, I'll argue against that. But firstly, it's a privilege to be here amongst you esteemed folks, and it's great to see so many people here after lunch. Although I can see a few people sleeping, so maybe I'll ask a couple of questions the other way around to make it a little more interactive and engaging. So in the work that I do, I'm primarily a technologist, and in the work that I do from a technology point of view for smart cities, building ICT for smart cities, I meet a lot of urban planners, architects, urban designers, etc., et al. Rather, and the often heard thing that I get, the remarks that I get are, let's build basic cities first, then let's talk about being smart. I mean, I've heard that so many times, and that's something that I'd like to take up. I'll give you two reasons. I'll address that in two ways, but can I ask a question first? Can somebody tell me what the population of India could be around now? Anybody? Sorry? Yeah, pretty much, I mean, good numbers. All of you are pretty much right. So the 2011 census, according to 2011 census, we are 1.21 billion people. And anybody want to guess how many people will be in 2030? 1.47 billion. So that's 260 billion people that will be added, well, roughly about 250 now, from now to another 15 years. That's 250 billion people that India will be adding. Of this 250 billion people that India is adding, 210 million are going to be in cities. As in, our current urban population is 377. Our urban population expected in 2030 is 588 million. That's 210 million people we're going to be adding to cities, which is an increase of almost 35% on an average, right? Whereas in the rural areas, as we now call rural areas, I'll give you a different term going forward, it's just an increase of 50 million people. So imagine this 210 million people pretty much will go into the top 10 cities of India, which are the 4 metros, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Ahmedabad, Surat, Pune, Jaipur possibly too. It's pretty much, this 210 million people are going to mainly be distributed around these top 10 cities. If you look at the 100 cities, yes, fair enough. I mean, you'll have an equal distribution there as well. But imagine your city, I mean, Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, increasing by an average of 50%, because that's what's going to happen. That's why you need a little more than what is conventional planning, what we can do conventionally. We need to do a lot more, because the sheer size of what and how we are growing, it is catastrophic if we continue with what we are doing. So yes, so that's, technology can aid, so that's one. The second is, to all these people, I mean, we have seen the mobile phone revolution, right? I mean, a lot of speakers ahead of me have spoken about the mobile phone revolution. Imagine if we in India have said, at that point of time and said, first, I mean, 15 years ago, 1996, right? That's when pretty much everything started in the mobile phone. Imagine if the folks had said, first give us wire phones. I mean, first give us handsets. I mean, first give us telephone connections, then talk about mobile connections. Imagine if the city and the state had decided to do that. We would not have evolved the way we did. So we need to leapfrog. I mean, the sheer necessity to leapfrog is now. Technology can aid, technology can assist. Technology is an enabler, as again, most of you, it's not something that you need to fight, embrace it. That's something that I have to ask of most of you people here. It's not something that you need to, get away from. Use it. I'll end it there.
Mr. Jha?
I think the topic which you have indicated is the role of state in the smart city. Now you have seen that now we are talking of a smart city. How this terminology has started, why this movement has started. Because of the initiative taken by the government. In every city, where a lot of cities are started, whether it's existing city, brown city, or greenfield city, the first initiative has to be taken by the government. Even to unite the various professionals sitting there, it is necessary the intervention of the government. unless there is institutional arrangements made to plan and develop the city, it will not be possible to progress it. We may talk a lot, but to progress it, there has to be institutional arrangement. Now the movement of smart city which has started, actually, it has started the competition among the various states, various municipal corporations, to develop their society, their cities as a smart city. Very few people understand what is a smart city. But at least the thinking has started that it should be improved, it should be done better. So I think that a state initiative, state intervention is very important. And where gradually the various professionals, citizens, and other participants start joining, then only it becomes successful.
So, sorry, just to follow up with that, so what are some of these institutional arrangements?
For example, if you have seen the policy document of Ministry of Urban Development, it says that there has to be SPV for each of those selected cities to implement a smart city program. Now that is SPV has to be in joint venture of the state government and local government. That is the first initiative. That is the first institutional arrangement which has been made. Because it was recognized that the existing municipal corporation or the state government with the existing law rules, it will not be possible to progress it fast. Therefore, it was the concept of SPV came. That it will be having it can frame new rules, new thoughts, it can take professionals instead of hanging on with the existing one, which probably take a long time to change their mindset. So the first initiative is institutional arrangement, which has been triggered.
So I can add some to that too. So from what Mr. Jha said, currently we are in what is termed as the second phase of the Smart City Challenge, where the selected 98, which everybody knows about, are creating their plans, formalizing according to what is called the SCP, the Smart City Plan, which the Ministry of Urban Development has laid out. You can go to the website and see it's called the Smart City Guidelines. So they're all preparing their plans according to that, where there is a lot of focus on area-based development, right? So they pick up one or two areas and they decide to develop that particular area. Then there are these pan-city solutions, which are citywide, not just in one area. You can develop them across cities. So these are all what you call issues laid down by the state, as in how this may not be the best, but this is what they think, how cities can grow faster. I mean, maybe if you can replicate something that is successful in one area, maybe you can have something across. Similarly, you have one solution or two solutions, I think it's two solutions that need to go across each state, across each city. Once that is done, then you have perhaps solid waste management, or perhaps ticketless smart cards that they can be used not just in the toll or travel, but for various other purposes too. So each city can suggest this, but these are broad frameworks that have been laid down by the state to say.
Okay, that brings me to this question of contextuality of some of these initiatives. So, for example, one of the things is that cities inherently are smart, in some ways, because people move to cities because of certain aspirations. They have historically moved to cities because of a certain kind of embeddedness in terms of opportunities that they get and other things, right? So I'm just trying to wonder, and historically, modern cities have actually had this kind of disdain for what already exists, right? They've been seeing cities as, on the one hand, yes, highly aspirational, but also messy, because all kinds of people do all kinds of things in the cities and in kind of following up their aspirations. So modern cities historically have erased these, right? And then sort of built themselves up in these kind of new utopias for the future. And many of those utopias have failed, right? So now the question is, are smart cities really looking at this kind of, UFO that will come and sit over existing cities? Or are they really talking about like embeddedness in real contexts, in real cities with real challenges? And how do you see that happening? What do you think needs to happen? Do you then need to have for example, tactical policies to actually start working with embedded contexts. So, I mean, I think I'll be interested to see each of your experiences, because each of you, in some ways, is also hands-on working with cities.
I think that's a very good question, and it's one of my main concerns. Even it became a PhD project. So, what's the narrative and the discursive regime when we talk about cities? One of the first things is, to me at least, is obvious that it has presented in a very generic way. So, fancy presentations fit quite well in congresses and events. Marketing campaigns and products fit very well, or try to fit for every city in the world. And that, to me, and maybe people working on the industry can have a more direct impression of what is happening. To me, it means that in the end, sooner or later, you will find that there is a local context that is not part of the marketing campaign. It was not on the presentation, but it's real, and it's making your project failing. It's making your project more expensive. It's making your teamwork getting away of the project because they don't feel comfortable. I'm not sure if that's happening, but it's easy that it can happen if we keep this idea that smart cities are a generic utopia for everyone. And the second thing is that I'm not a very good futurist, so I'm not really sure if I have a very hard impression of how I imagine the future, but I know, or at least the smart city debate should think about our previous experiences with other urban utopias. And the last one, it was basically built in the very same way as the smart city utopia, and that one was the car-dependent city built in the 20th century. And of course, the car was a great invention, was part of our society and made great things for us. But we were not aware of what was happening and the negative sides of that utopia that was orchestrated in a World Fair in New York. Maybe you can think of these images about the Futurama and this kind of imaginary construction of the aspiration of the society about the future of their cities. For several reasons, we are now trying to tackle the negative sides of that utopia. So to me, it's a way of thinking, because I'm not good at thinking of the future, but thinking about the past of if we're building the cities of the future, and because of the massive urbanization process we are witnessing, we only have one chance, we cannot fail. It will last for centuries. What we are doing now, it will be the ultimate massive world transformation in terms of demography. We can afford failing again. So to me, this idea has to be told in a way that we start thinking about the potential negative sides of the utopia we are building right now. The past utopia, the negative sides, we are struggling right now with them, and it's basically, but not only, climate change, and we are trying to figure out how to solve the big problem that the car-dependent city created in terms of emissions and other things. And maybe we should think of that sentence. I think it was a good science fiction is not the one that can think of the automobile, the car, but the one that can think of the traffic jam. And we were very good at imagining a car that would physically and socially reshape our cities and the way we lived in cities in the past century, but maybe we are not still thinking in the traffic jams of the smart city utopia we are trying to build right now.
I would point out that new technologies and new market models that benefit society and consumers, or even large infrastructure projects by the government, they create very powerful enemies of the status quo. There are always vested interests that benefit from things staying the way they are, and you need to expect that they're going to come out of the woodwork and they're going to be problems. And you see this with pretty much every technology that comes along. The car I talked about before led to a lot less horses around the world. Uber, when they entered the market here, they had a major incident, and then they were shut down for a long period of time until just this spring, I believe. And every new technology is going to have problems, but the question is, what is the alternative? So the Uber example, you had a terrible incident that happened. But there was a receipt of the woman getting into the Uber, who the Uber driver was, a license plate number, GPS coordinates of point A to point B, everything that the police would eventually need, my understanding is, to convict the guy and send him away for quite a long period of time. The contrary is technology preceding Uber. You have bad stories of cab drivers that have happened historically for a long time. And if a bad story were to happen, it's very difficult to track down exactly what was the license plate number. Is it your word against his word? What was his name? Do you remember what he looked like? And so these new technologies are going to have problems, but the question is, what is the alternative? And autonomous cars are the same way. In the beginning of them, you're probably going to have some accidents. But in the utopia stage, you have virtually zero accidents. And so you need to be aware of that. My experience is tactically is when you're leading these campaigns and working on technology, people become very scared of the world that they don't know. And those who benefit from the new technologies are usually very diffuse, and they almost don't know they benefit. It's everyone in society, or many people in society, and it's difficult to get them to mobilize. And that requires people like at this conference to be long-sighted and see into the future and recognize that autonomous cars are going to be here in the next 5 to 10 years. And it's going to be better, easier for them in some markets than in other markets. So right now they're doing a lot of 3D mapping, detailed 3D mapping of cities throughout Europe and throughout the United States. They aren't doing that detailed 3D mapping of Shanghai or Delhi or some of these other cities. It's going to be more difficult for these technologies to enter these markets if that groundwork hasn't been done. And so we can get in front of these technologies, or we can have our head in the mud and then be very surprised when these technologies are entering other markets and then avoiding one particular market or two. And that's where being tactical is important, and being on the ground and getting in front of these things, knowing you may not have the perfect solution, but a solution, and then kind of iterating from there is better than not even having your eyes on the ball.
Derek, I think just to follow up with that, it's not about not having these technologies, but how do they change when you start looking at really the context very closely? Right? I was following up some of the things that you were doing, where you said you were sort of advocating this kind of the breaking of cell phone locks, right? And that somehow sort of supports smaller businesses versus kind of larger businesses. And so in some ways, the contextuality of cities makes you shift, right? Like there may be certain technologies that may not be large and kind of top down, but there may be ways in which you have to kind of shift gears when you start looking at contexts which are very complex, which have real problems and real opportunities embedded within them. So do you think that happens, or is it possible to really look at a kind of generic idea of smart cities?
I mean, every situation's different. My example, I was working on a campaign in the United States. It was illegal for consumers to take a phone that they bought from AT&T or Verizon that would be locked to AT&T and Verizon, and then to unlock it to use on a different carrier. And that policy directly benefited AT&T and Verizon, but there's no reason why American consumers should and did go to jail for the crime of using their own technology. And so that's an example where you have these vested interest groups and they benefit very strongly, and you don't have very much competition going on. And so I think you want to have as much competition as possible. And one thing that's important is for the government to get out of the way, recognize there are some things the government does well, and then there are some things the government does not do well. One of them is typically running a business. I think it's a little bit ironic that our panel is on the state and innovation and how the state can help foster innovation, and then we're lucky enough to put up in accommodations a hotel run by the Indian government. It's a little bit ironic in the context of what are liberalization policies that are going to lead to more innovation.
Sorry to interrupt, we only have another 5 minutes.
Okay. So we'll follow up with Bipin and then Mr. Jha.
So your question was about embeddedness and the contextualities of smartness. Well, firstly, I would say smartness itself is a very relative term. Well, incidentally, relativity, we are in the 100th year of the special year of relativity, 2 days ago. So historically, if you look at it, even the cities of the Harappas and the Mayas, they were all smart. They were smart for their times. I think Harappa and all were famous for their windswept cities and their granaries and all that. So they were ahead of their time in those ways. It was in the context of that time. It was in the context of what they needed. And today we are in a completely different situation, in a completely different context. And even in those scenarios, every city has a different set of objectives. Every city has a different set of needs. Bombay, for example, well, as a port city, you would like to be, a financial capital, which is very different from the needs and objectives of Delhi or Bangalore. So each city has its own, in necessity, needs, and its own context of what they term as smartness. And the state has made provisions for that in what they have currently prescribed. It's not a one-size-fits-all. You are liable to choose what it is that you want to. Maybe there's a basic framework, but cities have the ability to choose the context and what it is that they'd like to embed smartness, what themselves with smartness. But having said that, I mean, with the way we are a technological society, let's face it, no matter what's said and done, we are a technological society and we're moving towards that. So the current form of what we know can add smartness to what we do is his ability to measure, etc., which we heard a lot of people speak about in the earlier session. And that is done primarily with the ability to collect data, analyze data, and do more with data. So we are heavily focused on data in the form of smartness today at a 30,000 feet level. At a ground level, it's contextual. And the second thing is, I would say, when you talk about smartness, it is not, it's not, I mean, I think my colleague had said it once, Sumit, that smartness is a journey, it's not a destination. And you will find it in the way you implement it. When you start, I can give you an example of what we're doing with, there's a solid waste management thing happening in the Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai. And they started off their solution with, tracking the garbage trucks. Very simple. I mean, they want to capture whether the garbage truck driver is actually going ahead and picking up garbage along the way. Then they realized that, they put these sensors on these, GPS sensors on these trucks, and they realized that this driver, yes, he's going along the plotted route very perfectly, but he's not picking up the garbage, right? So then they decided, let's put these RFID things on the truck and on the garbage bin so that only at a particular angle when the entire bin, what the contents of the bin are dumped into the truck, will the sensor, make contact, and then you know that the truck has picked up the garbage. So that's the next phase of evolution. Then they realized that, this guy's picking up the garbage all right, but then he's going and dumping it somewhere else and picking up debris from the builder because that's money for him. So, it's evolution. I mean, they realized that this is what happens in subsequent phases as they implemented the solution. And then they decided to go and put these weight sensors which detect the weight, the anomalies of the weight. And based on that, they realized that, okay, now he's taking the garbage, he's finally putting it at the landfill and not dumping it somewhere else. So these are solutions as you implement, as you put smartness to whatever it is that you do, it evolves. It's a journey. I mean, it's not just I'm architecting a smart solution and then it's going to be smart for the rest of it. It's evolutionary. Yeah, I'll stop it at that.
Yeah, I fully agree. The smartness, the smart city which you are talking, is a relative term. every time probably in last century also people were thinking that some city is very good. They may not use the terminology smart city. Actually, if you see the genesis of a smart city is providing a quality life, quality living and quality business. But in doing so, the technology comes into picture. But it's not the only technology, as told. That is evolving. As you find a problem, you evolve it. So we cannot say that only technology will solve. It's a human aspiration which have to be taken into consideration while developing the smart city. Some city may have different aspirations, some city may have different aspirations. Now we cannot measure everything on the same balance. We have to change our policy, our way of working as per the aspiration of that city. That's why you find that the state government have been, or local body have been given more freedom to choose their own vision. It's not imposed from the government, from the central government or the state government. Because each city has its own aspiration. Some are maybe are requiring only basic things. Some are going beyond that. Some are going beyond that. So that way there will be competition. And probably after a few years, after 10 years, you will find the whole scale has changed, whole methodology has changed, aspiration has changed.
Okay, how are we doing with time? Okay, so let's just wrap up. I think this is a very important panel because on the one hand, we really need to understand what the state actually, what role the state has to play in the making of cities. And since morning, we've been listening to a lot of different kinds of voices. And some of the voices actually also said that smart may not necessarily only be technologically oriented. There are many other ways in which one needs to really look at the smartness of cities, which are embedded in kind of everyday lives of people. And then when technologies come in, they also need to start becoming contextual and you need to start learning from them. So I think that's something that is really important. And also the idea that the state somehow is also kind of working at various levels, right? There's like the local government, there's the state government, there's the national government, and there's this kind of the need to actually work through various kind of levels to actually make things happen and make our cities sustainable, and also kind of look at the idea of generating smart cities. So I think we'll end with that. And thank you all for this wonderful panel and this very diverse kind of group and discussion here. Thank you.